congratulations on your electoral success so far. You're doing a great job. Matthew, my 14-year-old son, by the way, is a big fan, so shout out to him. Zack, my question is this. You made it clear that the Green Party's plan, if in power, would be to pull away from NATO. Do you think that would make Britain safer?
Thank you, Helder, and most of all, thank you for Matthew as well. It's always lovely to hear of a young person supporting the Green Party. So, Green Party conference, which I won't get too boring, in fact, I won't get boring at all, but Green Party policy is decided by membership. It's one member, one vote. And a few years ago, we decided that our policy was to reform NATO from within. Since then, Donald Trump has threatened to annex Greenland, and I think the President of America is increasingly unpredictable and unhinged. We know that Article 5 of NATO says an attack on one is an attack on all. And what I've not heard from any other party, and I will answer directly in a moment what I want to do, but I've not heard from any other leader what they intend to do if Donald Trump attacks or invades Greenland. And in fact, the Danish Prime Minister just said last week that he's very serious about it. So I think we need to talk about contingencies. The contingency I want to see is a closer relationship with our European neighbours, looking at what does mutual defence look like and security, as well as protecting this country. There was a report recently from the heads of MI5 and the MI6, so the Joint Intelligence Chiefs, that said the biggest threats to this country are actually the climate crisis, the risk of pandemic, cybersecurity and hacking. And actually, I think we need to be working with European neighbours as well as our own country on making sure we're dealing with these risks, as well as an increasingly unpredictable
But that's an
American
answer, frankly, that any of the other party leaders could have given. I don't think anyone says that we shouldn't be working closer with European countries on defence. And you sort of slightly fobbed it off on your party, saying, well, the party decides the policy at conference. But what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first thing I'd say is this is what other party leaders would say, but actually it wasn't about 6 months ago. And in fact, Keir Starmer has attacked me a few times on NATO, despite the fact he just gave a speech in Munich, which quite frankly, the majority of it I could have given 6 months ago. And he's slowly shifted to my position. Now, I don't want to be churlish about it. If the Prime Minister is moving to a position that I see as a better position, then I'm pleased about that. We've also seen Mark Carney talk very candidly about what a danger Donald Trump is and how the rest of the world needs to work together to make sure we're protecting our own national security. In terms of what I think, the reason why I said that I need to put Green Party policy forward first is because the rules of the party says I have to present that. I think it's become increasingly untenable with Donald Trump in power. And again, because of the problem of Greenland, that's why I want to see a closer relationship with Europe. I think we need to create
But do you want to withdraw from NATO? Let's put the cards on the table. Is that your own personal position?
It's not an immediate priority, but I do think in the long term, I think NATO is not working. I think that's not even a ideological position. It's a practical, pragmatic position based on the fact that 86% of our imports arms imports come from the United States. But they've shown over and over again they're not a reliable ally.
But you say that. But you've had Sweden, a former neutral country, and Finland join NATO over the past few years. You have always, I think, lauded Scandinavian countries for all sorts of different reasons, their sort of welfare system and all the rest of it. They've joined NATO because they see a current threat from Russia. Do you see that threat?
Russia's a huge threat, and Vladimir Putin is an autocrat and a dictator who has launched a brutal invasion on Ukraine. And in terms of alternative alliances, it might be that it looks exactly like NATO, but it just doesn't have the United States in it. So as I say, it's not kind of an ideological position.
But you're taking a very short-termist position, aren't you? Because if your sole reason is to leave NATO or form another defence pact, which the United States isn't in, is the sole reason is because Donald Trump is president. Well, he won't be in 3 years' time.
Well, so I think we need a short-termist position and a long-term. But actually, I think the short-term at the moment matters more because Donald Trump could be about to invade Greenland tomorrow or next week, and we've got to have a reaction to that. We've also seen increasing threats from Putin's Russia, and there's also the entire conversation here around China as well. And so for me, it all comes back to the same thing, which is how do you protect your own national security? The role of any prime minister, and indeed the role of any opposition party leader, is to protect people in this country. And I don't think we're protected right now by relying so heavily on Donald Trump when he's behaving so unpredictably. I want to see his work with people who are our actual allies and make sure we're working to create that mutual defence.
Helder, do you want to come back on what you've heard from Zack so far?
I do, Zach. I say this quite humbly, but as someone that actually served in a NATO base, it's very short-sighted. It's taken 8 years, and little details like NATO standard ammunition, 7.62, that can be produced in any NATO country. All of these things are so baked in, it would be almost impossible to remove ourselves from NATO now in the near future. It would take decades.
So, first of all, I recognise what Helder's saying there. It will be incredibly difficult, but that's why I think we need to have this conversation now. And at the risk of sounding like a broken record, which is never great on radio, so I'll avoid it too much, but we need a response to Donald Trump threatening to invade Greenland if he does invade Greenland.
Well, I think we've had that response, haven't we? And he hasn't invaded Greenland.
So far, but he still absolutely plans to do so, and that came from the Danish Prime Minister saying he's very serious about it. So I agree, we need a long-term vision on this, but what I'm saying is we can't bury our head in the sand. We need a response right now to what do we do in the event that our supposed ally invades one of our NATO allies.
Let's do a bit of role play. I'll play Vladimir Putin.
Odd.
You play yourself. So you sit down. We haven't got a long table, unfortunately, in the studio, but you're at one end. I, Vladimir Putin, at the other end. So, Mr. Polanski, what do you want from me?
Well, I think I could point to times where the ANC and Nelson Mandela or Ireland and the Troubles, where there's been huge conflict, and we have managed to negotiate and use diplomacy to get through this.
No, but what do you say to him?
Well, what I want to do is have a negotiation to find out what exactly it is that he wants, what we can negotiate, and how we can move towards a world without nuclear weapons. Now, this wouldn't just be the two of us. We need to make sure that there's other world leaders here. And it's almost like you're recreating the United Nations if it's doing what it's meant to do.
So how do I, as Vladimir Putin, benefit from this? Why should I give away any of my nuclear weapons? Because we could obliterate you.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? That any kind of time that anyone can obliterate someone, the other person can obliterate the other person too. And if you really want to protect your population, the best thing we could do is all denuclearize. So I think it's about having a conversation. We know from game theory, for instance, that this kind of role-playing doesn't work. What ends up happening is everyone has mutual assured destruction and everyone's dead.
But the fact is that Ukraine did negotiate away its nuclear weapons back in the 1990s on the condition that it would be protected by the other powers, including Russia. And we know that Russia then invaded Ukraine almost exactly 4 years ago. I think the anniversary is on Sunday. How could you ever trust anything that Vladimir Putin said to you?
I think it's a real issue, and I think the last 4 years, what we've seen in Ukraine has been devastating and brutal. I felt like when it first started on news channels, we would see every day fresh images of children and the kind of devastation that was being wrought on the country, and it feels like it's almost become normalized in the same way as the conversation in Palestine. Ultimately, I believe in self-sovereignty, and so that's why it's right we stand with the Ukrainian people.
Do you believe in self-sovereignty for the Chagos Islands?
No. Well, yes, I do believe in it for the Chagos Islands, which is why I support the deal.
Well, Donald Trump in the last few minutes has changed his mind again on the Chagos Islands and has said he's posted on Trump's social account to say that Keir Starmer is making a big mistake and should not lose control for any reason of these islands. So where do you stand on that?
Well, I mean, at the top of this hour, I called Donald Trump unhinged and unpredictable, and I think he's demonstrating it in real time, almost like he's listening to the show and responding on Truth Social. I think ultimately the ICJ said that what was happening was unlawful and we needed to give the islands back. I don't want to be a country that creates colonies, and so I think it's right that we let the people who live there have their own self-sovereignty.
So you want to close the base?
Again, I think we need to disentangle from the United States anyway, and I think that includes a review of US.
So you don't believe a Western base in the middle of that ocean, sort of like near India, near China? I mean, that is one of the most crucial strategic military bases in the world, and yet you'd be quite happy to close it.
Well, we know that it's a base that has Donald Trump's fingerprints all over it, and again, he's not acting.
There's been an American base there since 1967.
And Donald Trump is the president of the United States, and I think that changes the entire conversation.
Do you see him as more dangerous than China?
I don't think it's about comparing dangers. I think China is clearly a danger to us that's dangerous in various ways, and I think Donald Trump's dangerous in various ways. They're not the same ways, but also I don't think it's helpful to create a hierarchy of what oppression or threats are coming from presidents or prime ministers.
I'm a Jewish lady, lives in Manchester, a very circular Jew, very open to views and from everybody. What's your stand on anti-Semitism from the Green Party, please, Zach?
Thank you very much, Renee. And I'm sure you probably know this, but I'm a Jewish man from Manchester too, so love to my hometown. I'm one of 5 Jewish people who have ever been in leadership positions in British politics. So anti-Semitism is a position I take really seriously, in the same way that we have to talk about Islamophobia or any form of racism or hatred. And I think it has to be, and it is, totally unacceptable in our society. I think it exists both within political parties and society, because I think any political leader who tells you there's no racism in my party is clearly lying to you, because it exists and we've got to deal with it.
Does it exist within your party?
Yeah, I think it exists in every political party, because I think it exists in society too.
What are you doing to eliminate it in your party?
I think it's about, well, a few things. So first of all, leadership, in terms of literally being a political leader who answers questions like this. I think second is about making sure that there's training and awareness, so people have information and education about what is and isn't anti-Semitism. And then I think the last resort, but is important, is having a robust disciplinary process. So if there are examples of anti-Semitism, they can be dealt within the party and appropriate sanctions made.
A leaked internal dossier shows that Green activists are arguing that Zionism should be treated as a racist ideology and calling for a single Palestinian state to replace Israel. You've got motions being submitted to your spring conference proposing dropping the term anti-Semitism on the grounds that it discriminates against Arabs. I mean, that sounds incredible to any normal listener listening to this programme who can see that those two things are just barking mad.
Well, there's a lot to unpick there. And the first thing to talk about, again, is the Green Party democratic process. So any member can submit a policy to our conference, and we have 195,000 of them. So I have to be a little bit careful about commenting on every motion ever that arrives, but I'll take the substantive points of what you're saying. Again, as a Jewish person, I think it's really important that I speak out against anti-Semitism. I also think, as a political leader, it's important to talk about the genocide that's happening in Gaza and to talk about my solidarity with the Palestinian people. You can do both of those things. And I think far too often in our national discourse, anti-Semitism gets conflated.
So you don't believe in a single Palestinian state?
No. Well, I think it's important that it's up to the Palestinian and Israeli people, ultimately, what their self-sovereignty looks like. The reason why I said no initially is because I don't think it's for political leaders from other countries to wade in and decide what that looks like. What I support is a peaceful democratic process of people getting around the table and deciding what that looks like. Now, the difficulty there is who decides, because ultimately I don't trust the leaders in that region who have failed, I think, successive populations for a long time to be able to find a peaceful settlement. So I think it has to be for people on the ground, civil society organisations, and I think our role in it as the UK, or indeed more widely for other third countries, is to make sure that there's a fair process where people's voices are heard. Do
you think Zionism is racist?
So my family, the Holocaust is in our DNA. And I think the idea of Zionism initially was to make sure that there was a peaceful place for the Jewish people who were being persecuted right across Europe, and obviously most notably in Nazi Germany. In fact, my whole heritage involves pogroms in Ukraine, in Poland, and then arriving in the UK. So I think clearly when the idea of Zionism was created, that was about making sure there was a peaceful place for people to live. I think the version of Zionism that Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government put forward, I would say, is racist. It clearly involves the extermination of the Palestinian people. So I find the kind of conversation about the term less helpful, because actually lots of people define differently. I think the important thing is what can we do about that?
Let's just put this to bed. Zionism is not racist.
It depends what you mean by Zionism, and I think that's...
Well, I think most of us know what Zionism means.
I genuinely wouldn't know what you meant by Zionism, and I say that as a Jewish person. If we're talking about how Zionism...
You said you agreed with it a moment ago. You said it's in its initial incarnation, it was a perfectly reasonable thing.
But we're going back decades and decades, and I believe where it is now is very different to its initial incarnation.
But the basis of it is that Jewish people have a right to their own state.
I don't think that is the basis anymore if you're Benjamin Netanyahu. I think at this point he talks about from the river to the sea and casting out the Palestinians. It's not just talk.
Just as sort of Hamas were talking about from the river to the sea, casting out all Jews.
And both is horrific, but the difference is we're seeing the extermination of the Palestinian people on a daily basis. And so I think, again, if that's your definition of Zionism, then that is clearly racist. So again, I think it's less about the label and more what can we do as politicians against the Israeli government, which is stopping stopping the selling of arms, stopping the sharing of intelligence.
There'll be many Jewish people listening to this now. Can you speak directly to them? Because, I mean, it seems to me that you are equivocating on whether Zionism is a racist ideology. I mean, you're effectively, if this motion went through your conference, your mother and your sister, who've been openly pro-Israel, would be cast as racist. Now, you can't possibly, as leader of the Green Party, want that to happen.
I am equivocating, actually, and I'm openly equivocating.
How can you equivocate on something like that?
Because
given your heritage?
Because you need to define the label, first of all, and different people define the label in different ways. And so I find it unhelpful that, like, the whole conversation I don't think is particularly practical in order to get to steps. The steps I want to get to is a place where Israelis and Palestinians can live together, where there's peace in the region, and where we end the current genocide. To do that, I think we need to put pressure on the Israeli government, from the UK government, to put pressure on the Israeli government to end the arms sales, to end the sharing of intelligence, and to call to an end to the genocide. I find the conversation about labels less helpful, and actually what I would want to see is a more sensitive and nuanced conversation about what exactly it is we're talking about, because ultimately, by the end of it, I would hope that everyone wants peace.
Hello, Richard.
Hello there.
Hi.
My question is it safe for his potential policy about deregulating drugs?
Is it a safe idea to, deregulate drugs or easy access to them?
Or allow easier access to them.
Right. Zach?
Thank you, Richard. I guess what I'd say is at the moment what we have is easy access to drugs. I could walk down Camden High Street, for instance, and you'd be offered all sorts of things. What we have right now is a completely unregulated drug market, and I would say the war on drugs has totally and utterly failed. So the question becomes, what do we do about it to make sure that we're keeping people safe? And my argument has always been that we should legalise, control, and control is the important bit here, and regulate. So what does that mean in practice? It means if someone has a problematic relationship with drugs, then they have the support from a public health approach, that they're seeing someone who works for the National Health Service or someone who is a drug expert, rather than buying drugs in a back alley.
But do you not think, though, that if you make drugs easier to access, that could actually make the problem worse? I mean, you've never taken drugs. You've said that publicly. I've never taken drugs. So how can either of us possibly understand what the consequences of that are? If you make drugs easier to access, people are going to take more of them as night follows day.
Well, I think the evidence is actually the opposite. So when you cause prohibition or you make something illegal, that often makes it more desirable, particularly for younger people. And so I think it's about recognizing people have always taken drugs. People will always take drugs. So actually the vital question then becomes, how do you make sure that people are doing it in a way that protects them, protects the people around them? And also there's an economic argument here that brings lots of money into the treasury rather than just going on the black market.
Wouldn't you be more of a political leader, though, if you said, look, I've never taken drugs. I live a very happy life. Follow my example?
No, because I would say that would be moralising and evangelising. And although it's sometimes tempting to think, oh, what a wonderful person I am, everyone should do the same thing, I think it's up to people what they want to do as long as they're not hurting anyone else. And so I think if someone wants to take drugs, particularly if it's recreationally, have a great time. Just make sure that you're safe and you're keeping the people around you safe too.
Hello, Janie.
Hi, Iain and Zack. My question is, what would you say to Richard Tice in regards to his comment about net stupid zero?
Thank you, Janie. I find it's helpful not to say much to Richard Tice because I don't think any of it goes in, but I would, I'll answer your question directly. I think the idea of calling it net stupid zero is not worth giving a lot of attention to. We have a climate crisis. The science shows us that we have a climate crisis. The UN Secretary General says this is the vital decade of action where we need to take the action. Now, people will often say we also have a cost of living crisis, and that's absolutely true. But we know things like renewables, the cost of that is coming down all the time. And actually, if we invest in our economy and if we invest in the green economy to decarbonize and make sure we're protecting people's jobs and protecting people's wages and crucially lowering bills, because right now wages have been stuck in 2008, but people's bills are going higher and higher and higher, we can both tackle the climate crisis and the cost of living crisis at the same time. Finally, I would say we have some of the leakiest homes in Europe, and all I mean by that is people's homes aren't particularly insulated, so people are heating their homes and then the energy is just escaping. The cheapest bill is the one you don't have to pay, and if you insulated every single home in Britain that needs it, that would be a triple win. It would reduce bills, vital in a cost of living crisis, it would reduce emissions, vital in a climate crisis, and it would create hundreds of thousands of good green jobs that we could get people working and trained for.
Let's take a follow-up question from Max on WhatsApp, who says, as the Greens rise in popularity, have they abandoned their roots and left behind their rhetoric on animal welfare and climate emergency? I mean, that is something you have been accused of. So you talk a lot about Palestine, you talk about a lot about different issues. I don't remember hearing from you in the last 5 months a single speech on the environment.
Well, I've definitely given lots of speeches on the environment, and I can send them to you. But the point more widely, I think, is fair that I often talk about lowering bills, protecting the National Health Service and rebuilding our public services before I talk about the environment. And there's a very specific reason for that. When you go poll people and they say to people, what party do you trust on the environment and the climate crisis? I think it's something like 83% of people say the Green Party. So we're already very trusted on that. So when I'm talking to the public or to the nation, I always want people to know about our policies to tackle people's bills, to make sure that they have fair, affordable housing, and to make sure that we're protecting our National Health Service. When I'm in my elected role, so I'm also a London Assembly member, I challenge Sadiq Khan frequently. Almost every question I ask about from him is about the environment or the climate crisis, because then I'm in the actual elected chamber where I get the work done. So I think it just depends slightly on the context.
Peter's got a follow-up question on that related to this. How can Zack defend piling even more pressure on employers through a 4-day week? I think I read that you actually wanted, or some of the people in your party want a 3-day week.
Oh, I don't know about that. But yes, a 4-day week is definitely policy. Well, Borada, Henry, and to Peter, artificial intelligence does provide a lot of challenges. I also think, just to caveat, it provides lots of opportunities, and I never want us to be a Philistine about this. I think there's lots of people working in jobs where they're quite pleased about what artificial intelligence can do to remove some of the kind of more bureaucratic or repetitive parts. Without a doubt, though, there's huge issues if AI is controlled by huge tech companies. Keir Starmer, before he was Prime Minister, said he was going to work with creative workers, for instance. There was a whole initiative by the Trade Union Congress for TUC to bring Keir Starmer and Peter Kyle into a room with some of the creative workers. And actually what they ended up doing was working with some of the big tech firms. And so I think there's an issue here about wealth and power. In terms of the unemployment rate, I think it's quite obvious what we need to do. We need to make sure that people have good employment, that they're paid properly, and we also need to protect businesses. We know businesses have suffered from business rates, from rising energy bills, from rents. We saw in the last couple of days as well the worrying figures around youth unemployment. I'm pretty disgusted to see the government are floating the idea that they might stop the minimum wage for young people. The young people I speak to, some of them are still living, or many of them are living with their parents. They can't imagine ever even renting, never mind getting on the housing ladder. And it feels like a huge intergenerational injustice. And what I think the government are trying to do is pit business against young people. And it absolutely shouldn't be like that.
But if you make the minimum wage at a level where it is almost impossible for people in the hospitality industry, for example, to take more people on, and that, in fact, it encourages them to shed employees. I mean, that's not a good thing, is it? And can it really be justified paying an 18-year-old who is maybe a trainee in a company, hasn't got the same value to the company at 18 that a 29-year-old would have, having gone through the training? And I think a lot of people look at that and think, well, no, this is wrong, and it's going to destroy jobs.
Well, I'd really refute that assumption. I think if you're an 18-year-old and you're doing the same job as, say, a 21-year-old or a 22-year-old, then you should absolutely be paid the same amount. Ultimately, when you go home and you pay the rent, or you have to pay your bills or your food, those are all the same. So why should you not be paid the same rate?
Have you ever employed anyone?
No.
I mean, what before you became a politician, what was your main job?
Hospitality. So I was working as a gigging actor, but for anyone who's been an actor knows the majority of the time I wasn't working in the theatre. I was a barman, I was a waiter, I was doing a guest list on nightclubs, working at Heaven for a long time that I revisited recently. And actually the point, though, where I come from is when you're being paid properly and you're doing those hospitality jobs, you can then buy a cup of coffee at lunchtime. You can go for a pint in the pub if that's what you want. You can go spend in the entertainment industry.
But the point I was making is, and I would say, I've said this to a lot of Labour politicians, there isn't a single person in the cabinet who's ever run a business, who's ever employed anyone. Not a single one. And I wonder in your top team how many have actually employed people, because when you do get a very different perspective on a lot of these issues. And I wonder whether you feel that you've got enough experience to make those judgments.
Well, what I would say is since I became leader of the Green Party, we're increasing our staff team by about 80%. So I'm certainly involved with major management and leadership of the team right now. But I'd say more widely too, I think it comes back to what I originally started with. We do need to protect particularly small businesses. They're really under the cosh right now. I spoke last week at the same event that Andy Burnham and Angela Rayner were at, which was the Nighttime Economy Summit. And speaking to people there who run clubs, pubs, bars, they were telling me very clearly that the business rates means that some of them are going to struggle to survive. And so I don't think that's not an issue. That's a huge issue. But I don't think you solve that by cutting people's wages. I think the government solve it by making it easier for businesses, by putting money into our economy. And ultimately, especially if you're doing good for the community, then let's make sure you massively cut business rates, because that's important for our society.
Kevin says, how would Zack make the system fairer for graduates paying through the nose to repay their student loans?
Yeah, it's outrageous what's happened to students, particularly the freeze on thresholds for the Plan 2 loans. It's outrageous that a generation of young people were told they were going to have one deal, and then they've changed that mid-deal. I heard from one of our Young Green co-chairs just last week that they graduated 2 years ago. They're already in £76,000 worth of debt, and every single year it's going up a few thousand. So I think there's three things we can do in the immediate term. One is to reverse that freeze on Plan 2 loans. We need to make sure that interest is the same rate as CPI, and we also need to reduce the rate of repayment.